Perspectives in psychology. According to Oxford Languages, psychology is the scientific investigation of human thought and cognition, particularly as it relates to behavior in specific situations. While conducting specific investigation on human thoughts, theorists discover that there are different ways to look at specific situations, leading to a long list of diverse perspectives. In this presentation, we will look into two main psychological perspectives, which are behaviorism and cognitive psychology. With regards to these two perspectives, we will evaluate key assumptions, work of theorists, and the application of these two perspectives. We will also analyze the similarities and differences between behaviorism and cognitive psychology. First, let us look at behaviorism. This perspective reasons that an individual's behavior is an outcome of direct or indirect learning. It highlights mostly the problems that result from experience or behavior without giving attention to reason why some behaves in certain manner. Theorists subdivided behaviorism into two. Radical, meaning knowledge is derived from reaction mechanism, and social learning is where behavior is influenced by your surroundings or copying others' habits. With the above in mind, behaviorists believe that the fundamental issues are linked to operant and classical conditioning. These are learning processes that use reinforcement and punishment as form of training. So to further understand, we'll look at behaviorist experiments. We'll start with Ivan Pavlos, who discovered the classical conditioning. By experiment on dogs, he offered food to dogs and they would salivate due to food being an unconditional response, as this is a natural or biological response. In this experiment, Pavlov decided to ring a bell at the same time when food is being served. At first, there was no effect, or meaning that the bell was just a neutral stimulus. Eventually, the dog started to associate the sound of the bell with food. The dogs began drooling, therefore they had been conditioned, whereas the bell was now a conditioned stimulus. In conclusion, reinforcement was used as a learning process on these dogs. Let's look at another behaviorist. Frederick Skinner discovered operant conditioning. By experimenting on rats, he designed a cage known as the Skinner box, which he placed the rat inside that moves around. And in that box, there was a lever that when the rat pressed the lever, it would release the pellets. At the same time, there was a grill that would electrocute the rat. So in this experiment, the rat's behavior was conditioned by punishment. According to Skinner, behavior that is rewarded will be repeated and learned, while behavior that is punished will eventually disappear. Let's look at cognitive psychology. This refers to the mental processes that go into learning, comprehending, and being aware of something. This perspective believes that the mind processes should be scientifically studied, as our mind influences our behavior, including a person's memory, perception, language, reasoning, decision making, and below, this is the cognitive model in psychology. Cognitive psychologists, they believe that the human mind is like a computer, so they use theoretical and computer models to help them understand internal mental processes. These aspects on the model are studied indirectly via inference, meaning coming to understand what goes on in someone's mind based on observable behavior. To understand better the link between perception and cognitive, perception investigates how sensory organs work to determine how they interpret sensory data. In a book that was written in 2010 or released in 2010 by D. Simmons and Chabris, they conducted an invisible gorilla experiment where volunteers were instructed to count the number of basketballs that certain players threw, and as they conducted that experiment, they worked, and person wearing a gorilla suit just crossed the basketball court, but an enormous number they did not see the gorilla. This proved that information gathering about your surroundings, the primary step, and also multiple things at once are not possible for our brains to focus on, which is selective attention, and there's optical illusion as well that can also deceive our brains, known as perception. So now let's look at the key assumption evaluation, and we'll start with the behaviorism. So the key assumption is behavioral psychology assesses actions that are measurable and observable, and the results from studies on animals can be applied to humans. The nature approach holds that interaction with our surroundings are main sources of our behavior, and this perspective follows an objective and scientific methodology, conducting mostly lab-controlled experiments. Let's look at the strength and its limitation. We start with the strength. Carefully regulated labs, they minimize bias, and behaviorism is scientific credibility. For example, the rats experiment that we've just narrated, done by Skinner, it eliminated potential extraneous variable and was able to give a convincing example of how reinforcement affects behavior. And then it is also practical. The operant conditioning serves as a foundation for token economy systems, which frequently make use of institutions. For example, at a workplace, incentives can be introduced to increase productivity, and employees that are highly rewarded, they get the worker of the month. But it's got its limitations. The limitations are behaviorists may have oversimplified the learning process, resulting overlooking significant influence on human thought. And also the results from the experiments on animals cannot be applied to human behavior. In that rat experiment from Skinner, it only shed light on rat behavior and revealed a limited amount of information about human behavior. Let's go to the cognitive psychology. We look at the key assumption evaluation as well. It is possible to conduct empirical research on internal mental processes. Our schemas impact our mental processes, and similarly to how a computer operates, so does the mind. Individuals function as information processors involving input, data, and retrieval of data. Let's look at the strengths and the limitation as well. Their strengths are, it provides real-life application, facilitating our understanding in processes such as pattern of thought, known as schema. Like the example of a schema is when an individual gets a job offer, he has to go through the company information in preparation of joining the organization. And also another strength is that the objective methods such as EEG that records the mind activity, or MRI scans, can produce images of inside the body. This can be used to produce reliable outcomes. So let's look at the limitation. The laboratories that require participants to complete complex tests are controlled in a setting might lose some of their ecological validity. For instance, a study where participation drove using a steering wheel would have greater ecological validity than a study where participants drove with a mouse on a computer. This is because driving simulators assess driving skill. The greater the degree of ecological validity, the closer the response is to criterion. And also critics of cognitive psychology point out that it reduces human behavior to that of a computer, and it ignores influences of feelings and emotions on behavioral outcomes. Let's move on to our next. Let's look at the key theorists of the behavioral psychology. We're going to look at B.F. Skinner. We spoke about him. He was an American psychologist who did the lab rat experiment. So this concept is known as the operant conditioning and reinforcement. So eventually the rat learned through reward and punishment. Let's look at the evaluation through the establishment of the operant conditioning principles, the introduction of influential concept and development and innovative experiment techniques. Skinner's research made a significant contribution to the field of psychology, and through his work as well, he was able to challenge psychoanalysis dominance at the time and gain credibility as a quantitative science. But there are a few critics as well that criticize Skinner's theory, including the fact that it heavily relies on studies conducted on animals, particularly rats and pigeons, which raises concerns about exploitation and also that it compromises on the results of human behavior. Let's move on to the cognitive psychology. Let's look at the key theories. We're going to look at Jean Piaget. He was a Swiss psychologist. He was known for his work working with children's cognitive development and understanding. And what he said was that there are 4 major development phases, each of which corresponds to a set of cognitive capacities and levels of awareness of their surroundings. So these are the sensomotor stage, the birth to 2 years, pre-operational stage 2 to 7 years, concrete operational stage 7 to 11, and the formal operational stage of 11 to adult. So the evaluation, we look at the strength. Piaget was one of the first psychologists to systematically study cognitive development, making a huge contribution to the field, and his theories and findings have a huge impact on our modern society and education. Through natural conversation, he was also able to examine through how children reason and think at every stage of development until they reach the adulthood. But it had its own limitation as well. The samples lacked diversity and were small. As he studied through his own children or children of colleagues, he might have chosen instances of to bolster his theory. Let's look at analysis, behavioral and cognitive psychology. We're just going to analyze to get a better understanding of the similarities between and the differences as well between the two perspectives. There are few crucial areas that we'll concentrate on, which are nature and nurture, determinism versus free will, reductionism versus holism. Research methods can be empirical and non-empirical. So I've just designed a table here with similarities and differences, and then we'll go through the key area that I've mentioned earlier, the nature and the nurture. Both of them concur that behavior is influenced by nature, although in the nature versus nurture argument, behaviorism usually leans more towards the nature side. According to the difference now, according to the cognitive psychology, a person's behavior is shaped by both nature and nurture. A quotation from Vygotsky highlights the role that both nurture and nature plays in a child's development. If we look at determinism versus free will, they both agree that the thoughts and behaviors are influenced by past experience, but their difference is that behaviorists place more emphasis on external behaviors than internal, whereas cognitive is the opposite, due to recognizing the importance of both external variables like culture and environment as well as internal processes. Reductionism, the difference is that due to the belief that the behavior can be reduced to simpler elements and can be examined through stimulus, behaviorists have a tendency to be more reduction, whereas the cognitive view as a complex system and seek to comprehend the holistic aspect of human cognitive. Research methods, both perspectives are typically linked to empirical research methods. And if you look at the difference, although empirical research methods are typically utilized in cognitive psychology, this is not always the case for all studies. For instance, if we look at Vygotsky's theory of child development, has come under fire for being challenging to evaluate through scientific means. Now let's look at contemporary issues. Contemporary issues, this is the last part of our presentation. We are going to look at the evaluation of the cognitive, and then we'll look later at the behaviorist. So the cognitive psychology application evaluation, let's just give a scenario where a service user, Mike, recently went through a divorce and has been experiencing negative thoughts and feelings. This starts to interfere with his every aspect of his life. That's the workplace, social and family, leading to Mike falling into depression and needing medical help. So a mental health professional may use cognitive behavioral therapy, shortened to CBT. Depending with Mike's depression, the intensity of his depression, he might also require medication, which is a biological perspective for treatment. So the therapist will engage with Mike, find a diagnosis, and when Mike is aware of his diagnosis, he will be able to cope with specific challenges The therapist will focus on evidence-based treatment, which will help Mike to take ownership of the negative thoughts and turn them into logical. So the strength there for using CBT, it comes with treatment. It treats conditions like Mike's depression, and it's very successful. In comparison to other therapies, this is a quicker therapy with a few sessions, and it's well organized, but it's got its own limitations. The limitations are not all mental issues will be treated, like schizophrenia, and the sessions and homework done in between therapy can be strenuous and time consuming, so approach might not be appropriate for every person. Let's look at our last slide. We're looking at the behavioral psychology application evaluation. There's a scenario of a real estate team with 20 sales agents selling 5 houses each month, but the market is booming and the productivity is very low, and even individual morale is very low as well. So what does the manager do? They use the positive behavioral reinforcement in the form of awards and recognition to boost morale, staff drive and output. So the principle operant in behaviorism will apply in this scenario. The manager will introduce incentives such as shopping vouchers or high commission split to those that have reached the targets, and can also facilitate training, just refresher training courses to the rest of the team. It's got its strength. The strengths are performance and motivation can both be enhanced by rewards and recognition. And recognition and rewards can create a positive work culture where employees feel valued for their contribution, and can lead to increased job satisfaction and retention. At the same time, it's got limitations. The limitations might not deal with the root cause of low employee morale or motivation or output, and there can be resentment among employees, and the morale may suffer as a result of competitive environment. Replace one of the collaboration. This is where we end our presentation, and thank you so much for listening to the perspective of psychology.